What beer style do you look forward to when the weather starts to warm up? Looking for a beer that's low ABV, well-balanced, and easy drinking? Session beers, as they're called, are perfect to brew and drink this time of year. Pick up a copy of Session Beers from Brewers Publications, written by expert brewer Jennifer Talley, whom you've heard on this very program. Session Beers contains 24 homebrew recipes from Allagash White to Urban Chestnut Zwickel, all under 5% ABV. Available for $19.95 at brewerspublications.com. That's brewerspublications.com. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 5th, 2018. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby, editor of beerandwinejournal.com and author of the Homebrewer's Recipe Bible and Methods of Modern Home Brewing, joins us to talk about brewing darker beers. Well, not only does Chris give us tips on using dark grains, he goes on a rant or three about the subject. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows, our DVDs, our brewer's logbooks, and other basic brewing gear. You get a free sticker whenever you buy anything through our store. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook. We have a cool Basic Brewing app on iTunes and Amazon.com, and we're found all over the place where fine podcasts are served up. If you'd do us the favor of rating us on iTunes and maybe leaving a nice comment there, that'll help new listeners to find us. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and thank you very much to everybody who's done so already. If my count is right, if I haven't lost track somehow, this is episode number 600. 600. Holy cow. You know, when I came up with this idea, or the idea for this podcast to support the DVDs, or DVD at that time, there was only one, way back in 2005, I say that I thought maybe I'd get like 10 or maybe a dozen episodes before running out of things to say about homebrewing. But thanks to all the great guests who've been on the show and all of you listeners who keep sending in ideas and content, we are still going. It's incredible, and I greatly appreciate everybody who's taken part in this weird adventure. I was looking back yesterday at a Basic Brewing video episode Steve and I shot way back in 2006. It was the first episode where Steve cooked up something to pair with the homebrew. We looked so young, and Steve was a natural on camera during the cooking segment and really brought a lot to the table, literally, from the culinary side. And I'm thinking about reposting that episode on YouTube as a sort of flashback. It's, in the old format, so it looks kind of like Kinetoscope or something. It's like an old Milton Berle show or something, but it's still good stuff. In another early video episode that I watched, I mentioned being featured on the web series Rocket Boom. We were all excited about that because Rocket Boom was a big deal. You remember that? Rocket Boom. I looked up Rocket Boom, and there's a lot of 404 pages on there. It's unfortunate, but we're still going. We're still going strong. Let's take a quick look into the mailbag. Nick from Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, writes in after hearing the episode last week with Liz and Preston from Preston Rose Farm and Brewery. Nick says, I just listened to your latest podcast, and I got to say it made me a little depressed. About 15 years ago, I arrived at Arkansas Tech University to do my graduate research. Having grown up in Michigan and attended college there for my undergraduate degree, I'd never been to Arkansas. Imagine my shock when during my first day in Russellville, or Russellville, as we say around here, I was told that I now lived in a dry county. A dry county? What did that mean? How could that be? I thought this was the 21st century. Well, adapt I did. It is what drove me to home brewing, Nick says. But just starting out, I did not really enjoy my first beers, poorly made extract kits, who knows what yeast, and more than a little impatience on my part, so I was still on the lookout for tasty craft beers, which needless to say were not easy to come by. Now I hear of this wonderfully quaint brewery not too far away in Paris. If only that had been around when I was in grad school. I know at least a couple of us would have been regulars, Nick says. Nick says, I don't live in Arkansas anymore, but I have nothing but the fondest of memories of my stay there. Well, except for the summers, he says. Ugh, heat. I've lived all over the country, at least east of the Great Plains, and have never found a friendlier people or people that enjoyed a good time more than I did during my time in Arkansas. Down with the Reinheitsgebot. That's pandering, Nick. Saying that to me it's pandering. I appreciate that, Nick. I appreciate the note. Things are improving beer-wise in Arkansas, and I don't know if Pope County was Paris in Pope County. If it is, it's not dry anymore. Things are improving beer-wise in Arkansas. The heat in the summer, not so much, and I know that we don't have it as hot as some others do. So don't write in. Arkansas Tech in Russellville is home to the Wonder Boys, and the women athletes are known as the Golden Suns. I wonder how many other schools have separate nicknames like that for each gender. I know my friend Kyle would know that. I'll ask him this weekend. Well, whether your weather is blazing hot or freezing cold, you can't go wrong with an electric brewing system from our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from High Gravity in Tulsa. I love hearing from listeners who've taken the leap from propane to a high-gravity system with a Warthog controller because I know they're going to be happy. Steve and I love our electric brew-in-a-bag systems, but High Gravity also has more traditional configurations, 2- and 3-vessel systems, from 5 gallons all the way up to 2 barrels. And if you don't want to buy a turnkey system, you want to build your own system or retrofit what you've already got, High Gravity has a variety of electric components and Warthog controllers to fit your needs. In fact, you can check out High Gravity's YouTube channel to see some of those in action. From simple to sophisticated, Dave can build you a controller that you'll be happy with. And I think I've said happy more than once here. It's no wonder. A high-gravity electric system will take the pain out of propane. Check all they've got to offer at family-owned and operated highgravitybrew.com and use the code EBC75BB for $75 off your electric gear purchase. That's at our friends and sponsors, highgravitybrew.com. Okay, dark beers are not just for cold weather. A nice sessionable darker beer can be very refreshing at the end of a hot day. And Chris Colby's here to give us some advice and to have a few rants about brewing beers on the darker side. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's been a while.
Yeah, a little while.
So how's the book doing? We got to plug your books. You had the Homebrewers Recipe Bible, and then I can't remember the name of the second book.
Methods of Modern Homebrewing is the second one.
There you go. So are you working on the third book yet?
Not yet. I'm gonna pitch the third book idea this year. After pitching them another book idea first.
You are a busy man.
Yeah, I'd like to be.
So you've been working outside, or you still doing the container hops?
My hops all died out in 2011, the year the incredibly bitter drought here. They never even came up that year because we didn't get any precipitation basically all winter, and it didn't occur to me that because I had never had any problem in previous years. I didn't go out and water the rhizomes, which I should have, because they're still living even though they're below ground and mostly dormant. They've still got they still need a basic amount of water. And so they just never even came up that year. So no, I haven't been container gardening the hops. Usually
it's pretty hard to kill hops, but I've managed to do the same thing. I've managed to kill my hops as well. But the hops that I tried to kill one time and threw in the compost heap, they are still alive and well. So sometimes when
it takes some severe weather. I mean, That was a severe, severe drought for us.
And you also grew your own grain at one point, which is the transition, the segue into our conversation today, where we are talking about brewing darker beers and brewing with darker grains. And usually, when people think about darker beers, they think about wintertime and cold weather. But, if you do them right, darker beers can be just as quaffable and refreshing as lighter beers.
Sure. Oh, am I supposed to?
Yeah, that was. You're supposed to back me up on that one.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, beer can be beer year round. I mean, throughout the summer, I'm not going to be getting done with gardening and drinking like a bourbon barrel stout as a post gardening beer, but there are times when a good dry stout or just a good plain old porter is going to work just fine.
Yeah, or a bitter would be a nice refreshing beer on a sunny summer afternoon. So we're going to talk about some things that you got to think about when you're brewing darker beers. And first of all, I guess we ought to kind of list some of the styles. What are the styles that we're going to be covering, or these tips will be covering today?
I think the very darkest beers, mostly like stouts and porters. But I think a lot of what we say will apply to like brown ales, bitters, dark bitters, or what they call dark milds. Anything where the SRM puts it in the sort of deep brown and darker.
And those are different. Why? I mean, why? What difference does adding darker grains to your mash make?
One of the biggest impacts brewing a beer with dark grains is dark grains carry a certain amount of acidity. They're more acidic than pale malts, pale base malts in particular. And so, if you were to brew two beers side by side, or mash two grain bills side by side, using the same exact water, the mash with the dark grains would have a lower pH just because of the acidity of the dark grains. And what you want to do when you're brewing them is match your water profile to the beer you're brewing, so that when you mash in, the acidity of the grains is countered a little bit, and that it falls in the normal mash pH. And the usual way to do that is, if you happen to live somewhere like I do that has a lot of carbonates in the water, you don't have to do anything. It's just ready to go that way. But if you don't live somewhere, if you live somewhere where the level of carbonates in your water is very low, then you'd have to add them as a mineral to your mash.
And what are the minerals that we're looking for? If you go to the homebrew store, what are you looking for?
There's a couple different ones. There's calcium carbonate, which is just chalk. The drawback of using calcium carbonate, though, is that the solubility is very low. So you can measure out how much you need, but when you stir it into your mash, it's going to be slow. It's going to be slow to dissolve and take more time. So most people use sodium bicarbonate instead, which dissolves a little quicker. And that's what's sodium bicarbonate. It's baking soda, baking powder, baking soda.
Yeah, I get those mixed up.
It's baking soda.
And so you'd use a water calculator to figure out how much to add, I'm assuming, and looking at your water profile.
Yeah, there are several different water calculators out there. John Palmer has a spreadsheet. Martin Brugard has a water spreadsheet. There's an old one from Greg Noonan still kicking around. There's, and then most commercial beer or commercial software packages that deal with homebrew recipe formulation will have a section on that too. An interesting twist on that, though, is that what's his name has a site on this. Brew Kaiser, is that?
Oh yeah, Kai Troyster. Yeah,
Kai Troyster. Yeah. On his website, he has this one of the pages is about how, as if you look at crystal malts, the darker the crystal malt gets, the more acidic the grains get. But then if you look at dark grains, they are not as acidic as their color would indicate, right? Like you get, as you move up from 20 to 30 to 40 to 60 degree Lovibond crystal malts, it moves up the ladder, whereas the darkest grains, which, 3 to 500 Lovibond, you would expect them to be much more acidic, but they're really sort of hanging there right in the range of a dark crystal. So when you use brewing software to calculate how much, to calculate the mineral profile of your water based on the grain bill, you have to know, are they taking that into consideration or not? Are they just going by, because a lot of the older formulas you just used, the SRM of the beer, to come up with how much carbonates that you should use. But if you use a lot of the darkly roasted grains, like roasted barley or black malt, or even the darker chocolates, those really aren't as acidic as they, quote unquote, should be compared to other malts. And so you can end up overestimating how much of the carbonates you should add to the mash to adjust for the pH. But then, of course, given that carbonates are hard to go into solution, sometimes that sort of took care of itself, because if people added chalk to take care of the problem, the solubility of that was so low but that's really not fundamentally the way you want to approach it.
So if you don't correct
have two errors cancel each other.
Yeah, maybe I'll screw up and it'll be all right.
Yeah.
So if you don't correct for the higher acidity of some of these roasted malts or darkly roasted malts or grains, what happens? What's the repercussions?
In the worst case scenario, your mash pH gets too low and you start affecting the amount of conversion that you get. Maybe not all the starch converts, or it takes excessively long time. And additionally, with regards to the flavor of the final beer, if the pH is too low, because if the mash pH is too low, then in boiling it could boil so you're a little bit lower than you want. And then, of course, fermentation lowers it again. If you end up with a slightly low pH, the beer just tastes a little bit off. It's hard to describe. It's not quite sour. It's not that much more acidic. But one thing you'll notice with the dark grains, if pH is in the right, if you match the mineral content of your water well, the dark grains taste nice and roasted, and there's a full flavored character to them. Whereas if they're not, they're just kind of thin and slightly thin, slightly acidic, just not as good as they could be.
Yeah, I've tasted dark beers that I thought were sour. When I first tasted them, I was like, this is a little tart. So maybe I'm more sensitive to that, than other people. Some darker beers, of course, like Guinness, they say, it has a little bit of a sour beer mixed in the beer to achieve the character that it has. But, some darkly colored beers I sense as being a little tart.
Yeah, and that can just come from the pH being just a little lower than it maybe optimally could be.
So what kinds of grains are we talking about that achieve these darker colors?
Well, the sort of classic big three are roasted barley, which is an unmalted grain. It's just this barley seed that's roasted until it's usually in the vicinity of 500 degrees Lovibond, dark. Then there's black malt, which is essentially the same thing, except they start with malted grain and roast that till it's 500 degrees Lovibond ish. It varies between and among maltsters. and those two are similar in their degree of color, but they're different given that they're different starting points. That they have a slightly different flavor. And then there's chocolate malts, which can range anywhere from the 300 to 500, and probably you can probably find examples that are outside of that range even. But a lot of times they're upper 300s to around 400, and they're like black malt, just roasted slightly less.
And then you've got your black patent as well.
Yeah, black malt and black patent are the same
thing.
And then, these days there's been a profusion of malts coming out recently. Breeze, and this isn't even recently now. It's several years ago. They put out, what was it called, Midnight Wheat, the roasted wheat malt, and other maltsters have put out different kinds of roasted malts. And so there's a nice amount of variants out there, different kinds of roast malts for people to play around with.
Yeah, and some of those are debittered, right? So that the husks are taken off, so that you get more of a color impact than a roasty impact to the flavor.
Yeah, that started with, as far as I know, that started in maltsters are offering different kinds of black malt. They would have just ordinary black malt, and then they would have dehusked black malt, which they would call debittered. And the debittered, supposedly, it has a little less sharp of a flavor to it, a little more rounded. And some people swear by those, the debittered types, versus I don't know, and then some people like me swear by the bitter type specifically because it has that extra little crunch of the darkly roasted character.
Well, you're also a bitter man, so
bitter man, yes.
And the balance of these grains, not every beer style is the same as far as how much you would use of each of these, right?
Oh no, yeah. For stouts and porters, people use, it can be anything from, basically enough to turn the beer opaque, not see-through, to, much, much darker than that. Some imperial stouts or, other big stouts are so, have so much dark grains in them. They're dark enough that there's, the Spinal Tap, there's none more dark. You can keep adding dark grains to it, but it's not visibly going to change much, though you can get more roasted flavor. Yeah. And so, and then for other styles, there, brown ales, they verge into almost amber. Milds, there's dark milds that can be fairly dark to, they can get to almost an amberish, light brownish. And so, yeah, it's just all, how much of the dark grains you add, what their color rating is. And secondarily, there's minor things like how long their contact time is in the mash and how finely you crush it. You can get a little more color out of the dark grains if you crush them really finely. And you can get a little less if you only stir them in like at the last part of the mash, which some people do.
So let's talk about that. Should you, if you're using, these darker grains in your beer, should you mill it separately from your base malt?
You certainly can. A lot of people, a lot of dark beer brewers, will do that because if you take a look at these dark grains, they shrink during the roasting, so they're smaller than your typical pale malts. So if you just have your grist all mixed together and you run it through your mill, if you have it adjusted so that the pale malts get crushed adequately, the darker grain's not going to do very well, or at least it's not going to be crushed to the degree that your paler malts are. And you can either just accept that and just say, okay, I know that they're not that crushed well, but they're, you don't really need them to be, for the sake of starch conversion, because their interiors are all they're roasted into basically nothing. Or you can say I'm gonna take the dark grains and mill them separately. Tighten up the mill gap a little bit, or run them separately and crush them well. And really, I've done it both ways, and just out of laziness, I usually do it the first way. If you have your recipe and you brew it over and you know what that gives you, fine. If you want to go through milling it more finely, you might get a little bit extra color, a little bit extra flavor out of it, but you can. I figure, given the way that that I handle the dark grains, if I would crush them finer, I could maybe get away with adding, a half an ounce less, but who cares?
I've never milled them separately. It seems like to me that, and I've never done a side-by-side test, but it seems to me that especially grains like black patent are kind of more fragile than the base malts, and it seems like mixing them in there with the base malts, it seems like the darker grains get kind of broken up more quickly or more easily, than their lighter kiln counterparts.
Yeah, the roasted grains are definitely more fragile. They sort of shatter, and so the fact that they're not getting crushed per se going through doesn't mean that they're not broken up, to some extent. I guess it all depends on. There was a time in my homebrewing existence that I wanted to manipulate every single variable independently and do that all, and then I guess I got old and lazy and realized how little a lot of that amounted to, and because there's just no way. Like I've brewed my porter like a million, billion, trillion times, and I finally figured out there's just no way that even I, who knows what this is supposed to taste like, is going to be able to taste the difference between crushing the dark grain separately and crushing it, just mixing all the grist together and crushing it together. There's just, it wasn't for, it was fun, and I'm glad I went through that phase. But, from a practical standpoint, you have to wonder, especially at this scale, are you really, is the extra hassle you're going through really getting you anywhere?
It's like my audiophile friend in high school who, he upgraded his stereo speakers, and I said, "Well, do these sound better?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. If you look at the oscilloscope, it gets a better frequency response from the." And I said, "But can the human ear detect the difference?" Well, I don't know, probably not, but yeah. It makes me feel better. So if you're milling separately, should you take the extra effort to mash separately, or at least add them in at a different time from your base grains, your base malts?
A problem with that is that it depends on how you treat your water. If you've treated your water to brew a dark beer, and then you mash the pale malts at first, you're going to have potentially a mash pH that's too high. But if you mash, you use water treatment that would work well with a pale beer, and then mash just your pale grains. But then later you stir in the dark grains. That's still going to send your pH too low downstream. And so unless you want to mix in the dark grains and some carbonates, some minerals at the same time. And again, to me, and I know there's a lot of people who advocate this, and it's doing more, but I just stir it all in together. Get the who knows? Next week maybe I'll be telling people to brew in a bag. Well, who knows?
But you can also cold steep your dark grains separately?
Yeah, you can cold steep. Here's this is like the show to bring out my inner crotchiness in brewing. Like, yeah, you can cold steep if you want, but why not? If you don't like dark beers, don't brew dark beers, is what I was gonna say. I know people are like, oh, it brings a mellower quality to it. Well, if you don't like that, then don't brew it. If you want a mellower quality, I don't,
Again, the bitter man, the bitter brewer.
yeah, this is like the episode that pushes all my buttons.
Now, Steve and I made a Party Gal brew a couple months ago, I think it was by now. But I had the second runnings, and so I put I put water in the mash, and collected the wort, and then realized, oops, I forgot to, I'm making a darker beer here. I forgot to put the specialty grains in with the light colored mash that Steve had for his, Golden Strong. So what I did was I just took a gallon of water inside in the house and took a grain bag and, I actually just steeped those darker grains for, like 30 minutes at 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 C. And, made a darker bit of water there and just poured that into the boil and had to boil, a little longer to get rid of that, that extra water. And it worked. I mean, the beer tasted pretty good. So you don't have to combine it all into the same mash if you don't want to. But you can, it's just it's all in what you want to do.
Yeah, the thing about roasted grains is you don't expect there's not a lot of starch to be converted. There's effectively none. So you can steep the grains as you want separately. If that's what you want to do. If there's some, like I've done that on partial mash beers where I made the partial mash just all pale malt. And sort of I'm essentially just running off the wort and like it's in a sense like malt extract, and then I steeped the dark grains in the boil and just as you would making an extract beer, and that works. Sure. I mean, there's a lot of ways given the differences of the roasted grains from the paler grains that have the starchy interior. Those differences give you some options in brewing. I mean, there are breweries that add dark grains in the fermenter, like also the boil, to make color adjustments, and that's because in the fermenter you would think, well, grain is crawling with microorganisms, isn't it? How we're taught incorrectly that the pale malt has lots and lots of bacteria on the outside of it, and it does, but the thing is, the roasted malts don't, because they're roasted to the point where the heat kills off anything. They come out of the kiln sterile. Of course, they're then in the maltsters, in a malting house that are, there's plenty of stuff in the air, but you can, and a lot of brewers do, use the dark grains farther downstream than most homebrewers would ever consider. And then there's the color adjusting liquids, the Wireman Cinnamar, and the Breeze has I forget what they call it. It's basically just super dark liquid, and those are a lot of times added in the fermenter or later, in a bright tank to do color adjustments.
And I guess you could make your own color adjusting liquids yourself.
Yeah, I actually did that and wrote it up at one point. Yeah, just make a super super dark wort out of basically take, instead of brewing a stout wort where you've got maybe up to 10 or maybe up to 15% dark grains, do the same thing but have 60 to 75% dark grains in that, boil it, to sanitize it and just store it somewhere where it can be kept, stored in like a mason jar in your fridge. And yeah, you can use that as a dark coloring agent. And you can do things like brew brew a pale version of some beer, split it into two fermenters, and use that wort to darken the second one, so that you have sort of two versions of you could brew potentially an IPA and a dark IPA side by side.
Now, are there myths associated with dark beers? For instance, they're easier to brew because off flavors can hide more easily with the darker, roastier flavors.
Yeah. This really is the episode that just pushes all the crotchety buttons, because you hear that a lot. People they'll tell beginning brewers, brew a dark beer. The strong flavors will cover up any problems, and that's just 100% wrong. Have you ever had, I'm sure you have tasted a dark beer and tasted, it has diacetyl in it.
Oh yeah.
Okay. The flavor of roast is different than the flavor of diacetyl, so it's not going to cover up diacetyl. It's not going to cover up phenolics. It's not going to cover any of the basic beer faults. It's because you're tasting them, it's a different set of taste buds that are being activated by, and also there's your olfactory system is playing a large role as well in interpreting that. So yeah, they're not easier to brew because they're because they have quote unquote more flavor to them. They're just as difficult to brew as anything. So
if you've got a spoiled beer in the keg, pouring darkening liquids, color adjusting liquids in the keg is not going to save the beer.
Yeah, exactly. If your beer is contaminated or just somehow misbrewed, you're blending with dark beer isn't going to save it. You're just going to have twice as much horrible beer.
And another myth that I've heard, especially from people I'm related to, is, I don't like dark beers. They're too bitter. Not necessarily.
Yeah, that's another thing. And in a like manner, a lot of people think dark beers are stronger, and that's something which, of course, brewers, almost never have that misconception, because they understand it's how much malt you put in there, and the bitter thing is, it depends on, there is, just like with coffee, there is some bitterness associated with roast flavors. So any dark beer is going to have some amount of bitterness to it just because it's roasted, but it doesn't need to be too bitter. I mean, most beers like stouts and porters have a substantial amount of hops in them. So like a large percentage of the bitter flavors you're tasting are from hops, and you can dial it down. You can make a dark, like brown ale, keep the hopping really low, and it would not be particularly aggressively bitter.
And darker beers are not necessarily higher in alcohol. Like you hear people a lot say, I don't like that beer. It's too high in alcohol. It's too stout for me.
Yeah. And that's funny also, because if you get Guinness in the can, the draft version, with the widget and all that,
mm-hmm.
It's actually less alcoholic than most American Pilsners.
Wow.
But people think like, it's a dark beer. It's really strong. No, it's the dry stout version, the draft Guinness is very low in alcohol.
And I actually had somebody say that they went on a beer tour somewhere at some brewery, and they swear that the person giving the tour told them that, it was like one of these, giant, big, tall fermenters. And they swear that the tour guide told them that, like, light beer comes off the top and then darker beer comes off the bottom. like it was like a big, kind of upside down black and tan or something.
Kevin, I don't know. I think some breweries, when they hire the tour guides, don't really, I think they give them a script to read and don't supervise them, and they may bring their, because that was an old timey myth. I remember when I was a kid, and in spring they used to bring out Bock beers. Even the American beer companies all had a Bock beer, and it was like people were like, "Oh, that's the bottom of the barrel." The other part of that myth was in spring is when they cleaned the brewery. Like they let for a whole year they let they just let crap build up in their tanks, and at the end of the spring they filter it out, and it's perfectly good beer somehow. Yeah.
Let's tell the customers that this dark stuff we're just going to throw away as something special, so that they'll buy it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it wasn't. I don't know. I don't remember ever like a brewery advertising that, but that was like the myth along with it. Yeah, this is our waste material essentially.
And just to keep pushing your buttons, that it's probably harder to make a hazy porter.
Ugh. Oh, now we have it. Actually, the weird thing is you might be correct on that, because dark beers, for some reason, and I haven't figured this out, but I'm not the only person to have noticed this, tend to be clearer than other beers. If you look, even if you look at dark beers, they attenuate more light. Less light gets through, but it's not from haze in the beer. It's from just the darkness of the color. If you hold most dark beers up to a bright light, for some reason or other, and I'm guessing it's for some reason some of the darkest compounds that come off the husks that have been roasted somehow interact with haze forming proteins and drop them out. That's sort of my hand waving, unproven argument.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Yeah, proves me wrong.
So they're more particulates? Is that the word? Is that the science word? Particulate matter?
In a dark beer, there'd be less, because there'd be less haze there's less of because in a lot of those cloudy beers, it's just a colloidal suspension of, whatever is floating and hasn't been, filtered or settled or fined out. And, but in dark beers, it's easier. Another way to say this is it's easier to brew a clear dark beer than a clear pale beer.
Colloidal suspension sounds like a euphemism for something. I don't know what, but
a great band name, Colloidal Suspension. Here's my other. Should I go with my last button pushing thing about brown or dark beers?
You bet.
Okay, one thing you hear all the time about black patent is like, oh, it tastes burnt. It tastes like an ashtray. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, here's the thing. There's a difference. Yeah, this is. It's like the episode that I have an aneurysm and screaming at.
It was the dark beers that pushed him over the edge.
Dark beers. Yeah, he was happy one day, and then all of a sudden, James brought up dark beers and pushed him over the edge.
But black patent's not ashy.
Yeah, there's a difference between roasted and burned, and granted, the very heavily roasted can verge into that, but if you're getting any black patent that has an ashy taste to it or an actual burnt taste to it, something has gone wrong at the maltsters. And in fact, they probably would never, for their own reputation, they would never release that malt. Heavily roasted, yes, but that's a different flavor from burnt. And another thing that's interesting about black patent is people seem to think it has, because it's so dark, people tend to think that it has a very aggressive flavor to it, and actually it's less flavorful than roasted barley, and that's because for some reason, and I think it has to do more with just the way they vent the kiln or whatever, but black malt or black patent malt has very little aroma to it. If you stick take a handful of like roasted barley sometime, the roasted unmalted barley that people use for stouts, and smell it. It smells like coffee, or something very, very similar to coffee. Do the same thing with black malt, and it's really the intensity of the aroma coming off it is much, much lower. That's because it's all that has been blown off in the kiln somehow. And again, I think it's not so much the difference in the initial grain, but I think it's the way they handle it. Don't quote me on that though. But you can just, next time you're at the homebrew shop, just smell the difference between the two. And Black Patent actually has a fairly at lower levels, it has a fairly mild and neutral flavor. It's still roasty, obviously, because it's roasted, but it's only at fairly high levels that you get really a sharp kind of bitterness, sort of roasty bitterness out of it. So it's misunderstood because people for a long time, it was just easy to say like, oh, it's really heavily roasted and tastes burnt and blah, blah, blah. And nobody, either knew that burnt and roasted are two separate flavors, or, it sounded good. And so it got repeated over and over in homebrewing.
Yeah, we've done some steeping taste tests with, different steeping grains, and Black Patent it actually tasted sweet, or at least sweeter than I anticipated. I was surprised.
Yeah, it's if you forget everything you've ever heard about it and just actually analyze it, smell it, maybe steep a little bit of it and taste it, especially compared to either chocolate malt or roasted barley, you'll get a better idea of what it's for. And a lot of commercial breweries use black malt or Black Patent malt, same thing. Use it primarily for color adjustments. In that case, you don't want the color adding a lot of roasted, aromas to your beer. You just want, you've got a beer that's, say, dark gold, and you want it to be, light amber, and so you add, 1 or 2 degrees, SRM to your beer by just a small addition of either black malt in the mash, or a little bit in the boil, or a little bit of the color adjusting liquid in the fermenter or bright tank or something. Yeah, so it's a bit of a misunderstood. It's a great malt, really. I like it in porters. I've got a porter that, I don't know, back in the day it was called a robust porter, but now somehow that's not a thing anymore. It seems weird. Yeah. We're supposed to take beer styles seriously, but yet they come and go. I was like, how's that?
That's another button. So I guess there's so many different dark styles that yeast would maybe be dependent on which style you're brewing. But does yeast have an impact on the character of of the roast's color or flavor contribution?
That's an interesting question. I don't know.
If you can determine what that question was, feel free to answer it.
I'll answer any of the sub-questions that were in that long question. Yeah, I don't know. They showed a while ago, Chris White did a experiment where they determined that some yeast strains pulled more bitterness out of the beer than others. Typical, like their California ale yeast did relatively little attenuation of the IBUs, but some of their other European yeasts, the same beer brewed with the same amount of hops turned out substantially less hoppy. And I don't know if there's an equivalent thing going on with yeast strains. I guess that'd be something that someone would have to do the experiment, and in practical sense, that would be dealt with by, you would just adjust your recipe. If you did have one that, say, knocked down the roasted character a bit, you taste your beer and go, oh, this needs more roast malt, and you'd add it. Unless you switched to yeast all of a sudden, you wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. That's a good question, though.
Well, there you go. I got one in.
and on a happy note, rather than me just looking at the screen. Another thing.
My day. All right, Grandpa Chris. All right, so we have to say the names of your books again. The Homebrew Recipe Bible.
Homebrew Recipe Bible is the first one. And Methods of Modern Homebrewing.
There you go.
And my next book will be methods of crotchety homebrewing. The intro will be, you have to brew this way or I won't like you.
Get off my yard.
Get out of my front lawn, you teenagers.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me, James.
Thanks again to Chris. That's so not like Chris to have a strong opinion about anything. Be sure to check out his books if you haven't already. He really knows his stuff, of course. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to James at basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. Get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener with any DVD combo, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can find our logbooks where you can track and log up to 50 batches of beer. Check all that out at basicbrewingshop.com. And you get some free stickers until I've run out at when you order from basicbrewingshop.com. Don't forget you can join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com as well. It's all till next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is brought by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.